a strength of more than 5,000 aircraft, the United States Air Force is the largest in the world. In the front line stand the strategic bombers. The latest of these mighty aircraft is the Northrop B-2 Spirit with its stealth technology. Alongside the bombers are the fighters and fighter bombers. The USAF has over 700 F-15 Strike Eagles. It has more than twice this number of F-16 Fighting Falcons. This is an aircraft which has sold all over the world. In support of the frontline forces is the tanker fleet, which includes nearly 550 KC-135s. It is this massive air refueling capability that enables the US Air Force to deploy anywhere in the world in a matter of hours. There are also the transports, which include the massive C-5 Galaxy. For tactical support, there is that veritable workhorse, the C-130 Hercules. Yet of the world's major air forces, the USAF was one of the last to gain its independence. Indeed, this did not happen until 1947, and what brought it about was the formation of the Strategic Air Command over a year earlier. Its bombers were to carry the nuclear weapon and might well operate divorced from naval and land forces. In a similar development almost 30 years earlier, it had been the arrival of the strategic bomber during 1914-18 which brought about the birth of the world's first independent air arm, Britain's Royal Air Force. This was formed in April 1918, but unlike the US Armed Forces 30 years later, the RAF absorbed both the Army's and the Royal Navy's air wings. Yet when New York, Paris and London celebrated the end of the Great War, few had the future of air power uppermost in their minds. For the carnage of 1914-18 had been horrific. Millions of young men had been killed, and most people thought that the world could not suffer another conflict on the same scale. It must be the war to end all war. Under the Treaty of Versailles, which formally ended the war, Germany's armed forces were drastically reduced and all aggressive weapons forbidden. This included tanks, heavy guns, and military aircraft. The victorious Allies also rapidly reduced their vast wartime forces, with thousands of military aircraft produced during the war sold or scrapped. British defence policy switched back to its traditional priority of protection of the Empire, and the Royal Navy and Army saw little need for an independent air force. But Britain was now responsible for former Turkish territories in the Middle East. These were Palestine, Transjordan, and Mesopotamia, soon to be renamed Iraq. Here, unruly tribesmen were keeping many thousands of British troops tied down, troops whom the government wanted to demobilize in order to save money. Hugh Trenchard, head of the RAF, argued that aircraft could police the desert wastes very much more cheaply and efficiently than ground forces. He proposed that the RAF take over in the Middle East. Winston Churchill, then Minister for Air, supported him, and the government agreed. Thus was born the policy of air control, which served to maintain the independence of the RAF. Supported by a few armored cars, RAF aircraft roamed the desert. When a tribe gave trouble, warnings were given that its villages would be bombed. If it failed to heed these, one attack was usually sufficient. Using aircraft like the Vickers Victoria, the RAF also established an air route running from Cairo to Baghdad. Complete with emergency landing grounds stocked with fuel, it was to be used by Imperial Airways as part of its commercial route from Britain to India. Air control was also applied to the northwest frontier of India, where the tribesmen constantly kept the British forces on their toes. But Trenchard also had another string to his bow for preserving the RAF's independence. Trenchard exploited the widespread belief that the bomber would be the decisive weapon in future war. Indeed, the Italian general Giulio Due, in his book The Command of the Air, published in 1921, summed it up.
People who are bombed today as they were bombed yesterday, and who know that they will be bombed tomorrow and sin to the martyrdom, are bound at length to call for peace.
Italian dictator Benito Mussolini took note of Due's theories. As a result, the Italian Air Force achieved its independence in 1923, the second in the world to do so. America too had its air prophet, General Billy Mitchell. He had commanded the air service of the first US Army in France in 1918 and was convinced that air power was the weapon of the future. Official American policy laid down its primary role as reconnaissance for the Army and Navy. Mitchell thought otherwise and came to believe that an independent air force could better defend America's coastline than the Navy. He set out to prove this by a demonstration against some captured German warships.
The fleet had been assembled to watch and observe the bombing tests so that all could see what happened. Many considered this trial to be utterly useless because they reasoned that it was entirely impossible to sink or even injure a battleship. These people little knew the great accuracy of aerial bombing, which, at the present time, at battle ranges, is perhaps the most accurate method of hurling missiles.
It was an impressive demonstration, and Mitchell repeated it the following year, 1923, against two elderly American battleships. But all this did was to convince the US Navy that it must strengthen its own air arm. Airships were added to its armory in order to provide long-range maritime reconnaissance. The Navy even went to the extent of operating Curtiss and Boeing fighters from these. But in July 1925, one of these airships, the Shenandoah, was lost in a storm, many of her crew perishing. Billy Mitchell's frustration got the better of him, and he accused the Navy of negligence. As a result, Mitchell was court-martialed and sentenced to 5 years' loss of seniority. He therefore resigned from the army. Mitchell forsook the sword for the pen and wrote a number of books on air power. His disciples within the Army Air Corps, as it was renamed in 1926, did, however, pursue his ideas. The result, a decade later, would be a new breed of long-range bombers, notably the B-17 Flying Fortress. But naval air power was also developing in another direction, through the aircraft carrier. During the Great War, the British had largely led the way in developing this form of warship. The carrier was further boosted by the Washington Naval Conference, held during 1921-22. This laid down restrictions in both the size of navies and warships as a means of preventing future major wars. Warships were given a maximum tonnage, but some countries already had hulls laid down that exceeded this. Consequently, they were converted into carriers. Among those built were the USS Lexington and Saratoga, which could each carry some 60 aircraft. The French Navy had the Béarn. The British too constructed 4 carriers during the 1920s, but the Royal Navy was increasingly frustrated by the fact that Trenchard gave it low priority in terms of aircraft.
As soon as we get off, we'll get into formation as quick as you can. We'll climb up to about 8,000 if we can.
Naval carrier pilots were a special breed and needed nerves of steel. Accidents were frequent. To reduce them, the arrestor wire was developed. This helped to bring the aircraft quickly to a halt before it went over the side. Sometimes, though, the arrestor wire did not work properly. Catapults were also developed for launching aircraft, although this could be hazardous for the pilot. Nevertheless, catapults enabled conventional warships to have their own reconnaissance aircraft. But navies themselves did not wholly appreciate the influence that the aircraft carrier would have on the war at sea. That would only be realized during the years 1939-45. The air forces of the 1920s, independent and otherwise, also sought to demonstrate their importance through air displays to keep them in the public eye. This was especially in Britain, where in 1920, Trenchard instituted the Hendon Air Pageant. This was an annual event which enabled the RAF to demonstrate its skills and potential to the British public. It soon became one of the most popular of spectacles, attracting vast audiences. Military aircraft development in the interwar years concentrated on three areas: speed, altitude, and endurance. Speed was encapsulated in the Schneider Trophy for seaplanes. In 1920 and 21, the Italians won the trophy. The following year, it was the turn of the British. But in 1923, it was the turn of the Americans. This was largely thanks to the wet sleeve engine, which powered their Curtiss floatplanes. This could be run at much higher revolutions without overheating. There was another American winner in 1925, when the next competition was held at Chesapeake Bay. This was Jimmy Doolittle, who had already been the first to fly across the United States in less than 24 hours. Doolittle would go on to become one of America's greatest airmen. The British firm of Supermarine now developed a monoplane, the S-5, which won the trophy in 1927, piloted by a member of the RAF's high-speed flight. Building on this success, the aircraft was now refitted with a more powerful Rolls-Royce engine. The S-6, as it was now called, won the next Schneider Trophy competition, held 2 years later. Indeed, it was clocked at 328 miles per hour, a world airspeed record. If the British could win the trophy for a third time in a row, they would retain it. But the world was now suffering from the 1929 Wall Street crash, and there was no government money available. A wealthy philanthropist, Lady Houston, stepped in and donated the cash needed to upgrade the S-6's engine still further. But no other countries were able to enter the 1931 competition. Consequently, Flight Lieutenant John Boothman in the S-6B had a solo triumph, flying around the course at 340 miles per hour. The experience gained in Schneider aircraft design showed the way forward for the fighter. The second interwar aviation challenge of increasing the height ceiling at which aircraft could operate was dependent on two factors. First, the propeller had to be able to cope with ever less air the higher the aircraft flew. The pilot also faced the same problem. Oxygen masks were developed to overcome the pilot's problems. That of generating sufficient air to maintain the aircraft in flight was more difficult. Indeed, no aircraft between the wars got above 40,000 feet. Jet propulsion would be needed to overcome the propeller's limitations. Aircraft endurance was tackled in two ways. First, the planes themselves became capable of flying ever further non-stop. The first non-stop transatlantic flight by Britain's John Alcock and Arthur Whitten Brown in their modified Vickers Vimy bomber in 1919 ended in an Irish bog. They had flown nearly 2,000 miles from Newfoundland. 12 years later, Americans John Palando and Russell Boardman flew nearly 5,000 miles non-stop from New York to Istanbul, Turkey. The RAF became increasingly interested and formed an endurance flight alongside its high-speed flight. This carried out a number of long-distance flights to develop ways of quickly deploying air power to any corner of the British Empire that might be under threat. The Italian Air Force too achieved spectacular transatlantic flights with formations of flying boats. Italo Balbo, the Under Minister for Air, led them. Such was their impact that the word Balbo briefly entered the English language as meaning a large formation of aircraft. The 1920s also saw the development of air-to-air refueling as a means of keeping aircraft aloft. This culminated in the famous question mark flight of January 1929, when a Fokker C-2 of that name took off from Los Angeles and remained airborne for no less than 150 hours before returning to base. The pilots, Major Karl Spaatz and Captain Ira Eaker, would become leading American bomber commanders. Indeed, endurance was primarily pursued to give bomber aircraft an ever longer reach. For the air theorists believed that given the comparatively slow rate of climb of the biplane fighters of the day and the lack of a means to give sufficient early warning of the approach of hostile bombers, these could not be intercepted before reaching their target. Consequently, a strong bomber force was increasingly seen as the best deterrent to a sudden attack from the air. True, efforts were made to obtain international agreement on restricting the use of bombers as a weapon of war. At The Hague in Holland during the winter of 1922-23, a team of jurists did draw up draft rules for the conduct of air warfare, which forbade the bombing of all but strictly military targets, but these were never ratified. Furthermore, efforts were made at the various international disarmament conferences, like that held in Geneva during 1932 to 1934, to altogether ban the bomber as a weapon of war. But there was the stumbling block that civilian aircraft could easily be turned into bombers in time of war. By the mid-1930s, despite all efforts, the world was becoming more strident, peace ever more fragile. Fear of the bomber therefore increased. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. His political platform was based on throwing off the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles and making Germany great again. This meant rapidly increasing the size of Germany's emasculated armed forces, but the groundwork for this had already been laid during the 1920s. Detailed plans had been drawn up for a rapid expansion of the army, which had been restricted to 100,000 men. A secret air branch had also been established. The gliding clubs, which had sprung up all over Germany during the 1920s, provided a reservoir for the air crews needed to man the new air force. Germany's one surviving airline, Lufthansa, had ensured that aviation technology was kept current through a large design department. This often dictated to the German plane makers like Junkers and Heinkel and helped to develop airliners like the massive Junkers G-38. Furthermore, during the 1920s, Germany had agreed to share technology with Russia in exchange for German officers spending time there investigating armored warfare and military aviation. German types like the Heinkel HE-51 fighter, which had been built in secret, were also tested there. For Stalin too was keen to build up large and modern armed forces and believed that German expertise could help him achieve this. Hitler himself saw the value of air power and had used a Lufthansa Junkers Ju-52 for his electioneering. One of his first acts on coming to power was to order the setting up of an independent air force. Appointed to head the Luftwaffe was Hermann Göring, a longtime crony of Hitler's and a Great War air ace. Göring brought in two men to help him. One was Erhard Milch, who had been running Lufthansa with great success. The other was Ernst Udet, another distinguished 1914-18 fighter ace. They set to with a will, and in March 1935 Hitler was able to announce the existence of the Luftwaffe, as well as the introduction of conscription. Britain and France, faced with this fait accompli, could do little about it, since neither was prepared to go to war over these flagrant violations of Versailles. Instead, both countries began slowly to rearm. The United States, determined not to become embroiled in another European war, merely watched. But American military aviation continued to develop. By the early 1930s, the Army Air Corps was seen as essentially a bombing force. It began to be equipped with monoplane bombers like the Boeing B-9. Then came all-metal bombers, of which the B-12 was one of the first. These types were considerably faster than the biplane fighters, or pursuit planes as they were then called. Consequently, all metal planes appeared, of which the first in service was the P-26 Peashooter. These fighters were distinguished by their massive radial engines, which had been developed for speedplanes. In Europe, the war clouds were beginning to gather. Benito Mussolini had dreams of expanding his African empire, which consisted of Libya, Eritrea, and Italian Somaliland. He turned his eyes on Abyssinia, now Ethiopia. In October 1935, Italian forces invaded the country. The Air Force played a full part, especially in its bombing attacks on the poorly equipped and trained Abyssinians. One of the weapons the Italians employed was the poisonous gas bomb. This reinforced the belief that such weapons would be used if a major war came again to Europe, and added to fear of the bomber. Within 6 months, Abyssinia was totally overrun and annexed by Italy. The next flashpoint was Spain. Here, civil war broke out when army officers and other right-wing elements rose against the left-wing government in July 1936. The revolt began in Spanish Morocco. General Francisco Franco, the army commander here, requested German help to transport his troops across the sea to the Spanish mainland. Hitler responded immediately, and a fleet of Juncker's Ju-52 transports began the first military airlift in time of war. Mussolini also provided military help to the nationalists, as the rebels were called. Included in the Italian contribution was a large air contingent, which was welcomed by Franco. Hitler also sent tanks and an air element, the Condor Legion. But the government side was not without external help, since the Soviet Union sent arms, including aircraft, and military advisors. The Condor Legion initially consisted of Ju-52s, hastily converted to the bomber role, and Heinkel He-51 fighters. But these proved inferior to the Russian Polikarpov I-15 and I-16, which were powered by American Wright Cyclone engines. The Italians also suffered a similar inferiority with their Fiat CR-32 fighters. More modern German types were therefore sent to Spain, including the Heinkel He-111 bomber. There was also the Messerschmitt Me-109 fighter, although this was to prove an equal match rather than being superior to the I-16. But it was not fighter rivalry which concentrated the world's attention on Spain, but the bombers. They pounded towns and cities in government hands, especially the capital, Madrid. Scores of innocent civilians lost their lives. But the most dramatic demonstration of the brutality of the bomber took place on the 26th of April 1937 at Guernica on Spain's northern Atlantic coast. Guernica was attacked by German Heinkel and Junkers bombers. A British journalist described what happened.
To the people within Guernica, it was not a question of figures, but of inquantitative and immeasurable terror. All they could hear was the drumbeat of the engines and the split of explosions, again and again, until they sounded dull enough. They could see no more but the trembling doors of their refuges and their own helpless faces, and sometimes, if they were in the streets, the points of fire where the silver tubes struck. These fell many at a time, for they dropped 24 together on a single spinning rod.
The attack tore the heart out of the town, and some 2,000 of its inhabitants were killed or injured. The world was horrified. 50 years later, the planes returned to Guernica. This time they dropped flowers in memory of those who had perished on that terrible day. But that same year, 1937, saw another demonstration of the bomber as a terror weapon in China, many thousands of miles away from Spain. Here, Japan's expansionism triggered a war which was to last for 8 years and would see much of China fall into its hands. Japanese air attacks on Shanghai, Nanking, and other cities were as brutal as those in Spain. In December 1937, Japanese aircraft even struck at British and American warships, including the patrol vessel USS Panay. The crew suffered casualties and were forced to abandon the vessel, which later sank. Tokyo later apologized for these attacks.
It was a great mistake. It was an unintentional and unexpected occurrence. The Japanese government and people wished to express their sincerest and profoundest regrets.
But these attacks angered Washington into sending financial aid to the hard-pressed Chinese. Back in Europe, the pace of rearmament had been quickening. Hitler saw his air force as a tool to threaten neighboring countries. To this end, it had a large number of medium-range bombers. But the Luftwaffe also had an important role to play in ground warfare, for the Germans had created panzer divisions and developed a concept of high-speed armored warfare in which air power would be used as aerial artillery. A key player in this blitzkrieg, or lightning war, was the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber. The Stuka was a highly accurate weapon, but as time would reveal, it also would prove to be very effective at demoralizing enemy troops and civilians. British and French rearmament also gathered pace. The British policy was to try and match the Luftwaffe in numbers of aircraft. Thus, although specifications were drawn up for 4-engined heavy bombers, by 1939 RAF Bomber Command consisted mainly of medium bombers, like the Vickers Wellington, This could carry 4,500 pounds of bombs a distance of 1,200 miles. There were also light bombers, such as the Fairy Battle. However, the RAF did now have two excellent fighters. One was the Supermarine Spitfire, a development of the Schneider Trophy-winning S-6. The other was the Hawker Hurricane, which was to be the backbone of RAF Fighter Command during 1939-40. The French Air Force, which had finally gained its independence in 1934, was not as well placed, with aircraft like the Block 200 bomber obsolete almost as soon as they entered service. One problem was that France's defense policy was so rooted in the Maginot Line, the elaborate defensive belt constructed on the Franco-German border, that offensive weapons like strategic bombers were politically questionable. This left the French Air Force without any clear doctrine, especially since the army considered that it should be merely its servant. The French aircraft industry was also suffering from political indecision and industrial disruption. Consequently, its production rates were low, and the general quality of aircraft, typified by the gull-winged Loiret 40 fighter, was below that of the Germans. Indeed, in 1938, the French turned to the United States and procured American aircraft, including Curtiss Hawk 75s, to increase its strength. The British did likewise, ordering 200 Lockheed Hudsons for use as bombers. During 1938, the pace of the march to war in Europe quickened. Hitler was now bent on a policy of expansionism, and in March, German troops entered Austria, which was incorporated into the Greater German Reich. Hitler then turned his attention to Czechoslovakia, demanding that it hand over its extreme western province of Sudetenland, which contained a sizable German minority. The Czechs refused, declaring that they were prepared to fight, and war seemed inevitable. In September 1938, the Sudetenland crisis came to a head. After conferring with the French, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain made 2 visits to Germany. It was, in effect, what would now be called shuttle diplomacy. In Paris and London, preparations were made to cope with what was expected to be the first blows of the war, bombing attacks from the air. These precautions included the issue of gas masks to the civil population. War was averted, however, at the expense of Czechoslovakia, which was forced to cede Sudetenland to the delight of the ethnic Germans there. The country was subsequently dismembered by Hitler. But the people of Europe were now beginning to accept that war was inevitable, especially when Hitler turned his eye upon neighboring Poland, and Paris and London pledged themselves to come to her aid. In Britain, the emphasis was now turning more towards fighters. Indeed, there was a growing official belief that the bombers could be prevented from reaching their targets. One reason for this was the dramatically increased rates of climb of the Spitfire and Hurricane over earlier biplane types. But the other was another and as yet highly secret cause for this growing optimism. This was the development of radar. Radar had a dramatically superior detection range over the sound-ranging early warning devices then in service. Under the codename Home Chain, the British began to construct a series of radar stations covering their coasts. The Germans had their suspicions, and in the summer of 1939, they sent their last giant Zeppelin airship, Graf Zeppelin II, across the North Sea, in an unsuccessful attempt to find out more about these mysterious radar stations. Across the Atlantic, Americans continued to watch as Europe moved closer to the abyss. By now, a new generation of modern combat aircraft was coming into service. Foremost among these, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, which first flew in 1935. Its heavy defensive armament of machine guns would, it was believed, enable it to ward off hostile fighters. There were also new fighters, including the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, 230 of which were immediately ordered by the French. Another country as yet standing by was Stalin's Russia, which in August 1939 agreed a non-aggression pact with Germany. But the Red Air Force was also preparing, the backbone of its strength being the Polikarpov fighters which had fought in Spain. There were too bombers like the Tupolev TB3. During those last 2 weeks of August 1939, the German armed forces were moved into position for the invasion of Poland. The Luftwaffe had its orders and was preparing to carry them out to the letter. But uppermost in everyone's minds was one burning question. Would the bomber come to dominate the conflict, as air theorists had preached, and governments and civil populations feared? The world was about to find out.